fare as much as in Italy, always stressed that political speech is rooted in different linguistic and historical traditions. But I think that globalization and the process of European integration require either possibly a joint vocabulary or at least the possibility of understanding each other. Norberto Bobbio, for example, remembered how some political words have totally different resonances in the minds of people according to the position they have towards a particular kind of ideology. Think, for example, of communism for a convinced communist in the 40s or 50s, where they saw it as the most effective way to oppose Nazism first and authoritarian, other kind of authoritarian ideologies afterwards, and the way even a left-wing intellectual would today receive the word communism. Or think of the word laicismo. I wouldn't use an English word because there is no English word to translate this. We have it in most Neo-Latin languages. A fundamentalist Catholic would think not only of laicismo but also of laicidad as something that is terribly limitative of his own freedom of expression. I was astonished many years ago when I visited a Spanish bookshop in Madrid, and the book on religious freedom was a book that discussed the persecutions of the Catholic Church in Spain, of course, in the Civil War, whereas if a book with that title were published in Italy, it would probably deal with issues such as the persecution that Catholic imposed on non-believers and mostly on Jews, on Protestants, or people of different faiths. Think of federalism. Last year in this season I was in Prague discussing European federalism. There were 3 Western European, a French, a German, and myself. The audience was mainly composed by people from Eastern Europe. When I, the German, and the French were using the word federalism, we were obviously thinking of the United States of America, of Switzerland, of the success story of the Federal Republic of Germany. And the audience immediately thought of the Soviet Union, communist Yugoslavia, and communist Czechoslovakia, because that was labeled as federalism. Or think the discussion that we had this morning on the idea of nationalism. Even a very cultivated European, not born in this part of Europe, if he heard or she heard the word nationalism related to the contemporary history of the Spanish state, would immediately think of Franco's army during the Civil War. He would not think of nationalism as the democratic request of more autonomy or even independence by Catalonia, by the Basque region, by Galicia. So we at least must always be very much aware that when we give a definition, when we use political definitions, the problem of communicating what this means is always very controversial. Second difficulty, the thing liberalism, unlike socialism, was born before its theory. Liberalism was a product, basically proto-liberalism, as I described it, talking of Locke, was basically born in 17th century England, when a melting pot of different demands for reform in the political area, in the economic area, in the religious area, were boiling inside the melting pot of the Great Rebellion first and the Glorious Revolution afterwards. But the thing anticipated the theory. Think and theory were both born before the name was born. And the name was born, tellingly enough, because liberalism is very difficult to grasp anywhere. The word liberal, indicating a political position or a political theory, was born in this part of Europe during the period of the Cortes de Cádiz, 1810-1812, when the Parliamentary Assembly was drafting the first Spanish constitution protected by a British fleet in Cádiz. And very tellingly, there, a Partido Liberal was opposed to a Partido Servil. That is a birthing moment that we should always remember. Fourth difficulty, liberalism, again, as opposed to socialism, at least at the beginning of socialism, does not coincide with one single philosophy. I know that this is not very well accepted by a lot of liberal friends who are very much attached to the idea that liberalism is one thing with their own personal philosophical views, but in reality, liberalism has always been a philosophically polygamist, or libertine in the trivial sense of the word, and a merely political theory that married from time to time with empiricism, with the philosophies of the Enlightenment, with Kant's criticism, with idealism, with positivism, with instrumentalism, and with the most diverse analytical or continental political philosophies, philosophies of our age. And also with libertinism, rationalism, atheism, some very important currents of Protestant theology that were instrumental at the birth of liberalism, and even with some maverick and minoritarian brands of Catholicism. Fifth and last difficulty that I think should be put in light is that liberalism largely coincides, as we said at the beginning, with a civilization, despite countless contradictions, and yet has a universalistic vocation. And it is not the common fruit of the Western civilization as a whole, even though it grew on some typically Western cultural depositories. Among these must be remembered, because each of them opened the way to the possibility of liberalism to be born. One is the heritage of the Greek classical philosophical tradition on the one hand, and of the constitutionalism, as it was called by McEwen, of the antiquity as reassessed, reappropriated by scholars, and revitalized since their legacies. Second, and this is always underestimated to a large extent both by philosophers, often by historians and by economists, the heritage of Roman law and common law, that is, the rule of law, that was gradually led by liberals to cover even the production of new laws under the judicial review of ordinary or constitutional courts. Third root is the new Western idea of the individual. Sometimes we are expecting that everybody has this kind of anthropology in the world, but we are the exception, not the different peoples to which we every now and then attribute the strange idea not to have this idea of ours, of the individual, but it is an idea that was born in the ancient Low Countries and in northern and central Italy only in the late Middle Ages, and is well visible in the material culture and in the figurative arts and literature of both European regions. And finally, the central role of the incoercibility of individual conscience that was born with Christianity but empowered by the rift caused by the Reformation. And there is another one, it was not four, but five, the disenchantment of the medieval world, also an unintentionally joint result of both libertinism and the Reformation, that forced, to a small extent, also the Catholic Church in the Counter-Reformation to rationalize its doctrine and impose a sharp resizing to the spontaneous and superstitious popular faith, and the birth of modern science and tolerance as a lesson taught to us by religious wars. So liberalism and tolerance as a value, not as a consequence of the impotence of power to crush the dissent, is basically a Dutch, English, American, and French product that proved capable in the last 3 centuries of being introduced, transplanted, copied, adapted, sometimes even improved in very different cultural and political environments. In Italy, for example, it was almost a constructivist process. Italian intellectuals and many liberal politicians in the 19th century felt that they remained very much backward in comparison to other European nations, and probably the same feeling existed also in Spain at the time, and consciously introduced in Italy the institutions that were those of British parliamentarism, the principles of 89 human rights from France, sometimes for the most enlightened people of the period, given the democracy of a very faraway country that was the United States at their beginning. And in Spain, years ago, there was a book that was published by Manuel Moreno Alonso, La Forja del Liberalismo en España, that makes light on the very important relevance of the British example also for the birth of liberalism in the Iberian Peninsula during the Peninsular War. So much so, the introduction of liberalism in other countries has been successful, that no political force, as we mentioned this morning, in our countries can survive today on an entirely or totally anti-liberal platform. This is a difficulty for us, of course, because if everybody is liberal, who are the liberals? But in the end, at least the others, those who are not liberals, have to pay lip service to some of the basic principles of liberalism, even when their policies openly contradict them. Hence, every definition of liberalism can only be what is called in social sciences an ideal type. That is, an abstract intellectual construction to which we can compare what exists in history and in societies in order to be able to appreciate what is most liberal, what is least liberal, and of course what is most illiberal or anti-liberal. We should therefore try to propose a definition after all these preliminaries, and this is my proposal. Liberalism can be defined as a theory of the ends and the theory of the means. That is, maximizing individual freedom and self-determination, mainly through the instrument of the legal limitation of powers. I'm not very much, because of this way of constructing political definitions, I'm not so keen about building up also distinction, as it is often made, between classical liberalism, social liberalism, or what has recently been labeled as Bildungsliberalismus, a phrase that is almost not translatable in many languages. We had a friend of ours, Patrick Van Schie, that proposed this new basket where to put some forms of liberalism during our assembly in Brussels last week in a very brilliant conference lecture he gave us. So I would prefer to stress on the fact that you can't find anything that is openly illiberal, but you have then, and you have had, especially throughout the course of contemporary history, different brands of liberalism. Anyway, if we accepted the definition I proposed, the consequence is that liberalism is a perpetual work in progress. First, because from the very beginning it was connected to an ever more comprehensive and ever more consistent fight against authoritarian traditions and beliefs. And because the natural inclination of every political, traditional, bureaucratic, social and economic power is to confront and overrun its imposed limits. Second, and as a consequence of that, because liberalism was never restricted to a limitation of merely political power. Liberalism always aimed at imposing limits also on the ever-possible tyranny of a democratic majority, on the abuse of economic power through antitrust legislation, protecting free market and competition, and through a legal protection of workers from abuse, and defending consumers from fraud and adulteration. On the abuse of power even inside communities and families, advocating equal rights for women since Locke's time and his reduction of marriage basically to its merely legal framework, and protecting children from abuse and also indoctrination, very important today. Third and finally, because the economic means necessary to fulfill the goal of enhancing individual self-determination do change with in front of the different challenges we always have to face. The brand of liberalism that was mostly recognized as such and defined as such after the end of World War II and until a few decades ago, the one that largely influenced most of the political spectrum in most Western democracies throughout the Cold War, not only required the guarantee and the implementation of the individual liberties that were trampled by communist and other totalitarian regimes, but also included a push towards ever greater inclusion and empowerment of each individual in the actual exercise of his/her citizenship and liberal rights. That had originally been a typically liberal idea, born in the Victorian age in the same country, England, that had given birth to liberalism 2 centuries before. The idea was that public powers should actually put the individual in the condition of making real use of his/her liberties. The welfare state was first conceived and designed by liberals, as the card-carrying member of the British Liberal Party, Keynes and Beveridge, who were not socialists and not social democrats. And for years, not only communists, but a lot of mainstream socialists have been accusing the wicked liberal economist John Maynard Keynes for having rescued capitalism from its certain downfall, thus preventing the rise of a happy global socialist society. It is a fact that almost all national political classes and state bureaucracies have long been squandering since to their own advantage much of the benefits that they were supposed to make available to a majority of citizens. A healthy liberal mistrust towards ever-possible abuses committed by the holders of political power and a less naive and more sober notion of democracy should have suggested that public is by no means equivalent per se to caring for public interest. Moreover, the demographical and technological transformations of the last 3 decades at least nowadays impose deep reforms of the welfare systems in order to assure their financial sustainability. But as it is frequent in politics and in social science, and in history, for example, an overreaction took place since the late 70s on both sides of the Atlantic, and in the end substituted the liberal consensus that had been shared in most common countries by the moderate left and moderate right alike while we were containing and opposing Soviet communism, with what was usually derogatively called liberal consensus in the 90s. It was more inclined to accept growing inequalities and especially decreasing equality in opportunities. In some countries, namely in France, as we mentioned this morning, and elsewhere to a smaller extent, that essentially merely economical and very often caricaturized doctrine became synonymous with liberalism. To the point that the previous meaning, liberalism as synonymous for political freedom and freedom of conscience in the first place, has long been labeled as outdated, vieilli, by French dictionaries. So that even the Chilean Pinochet regime, as it was mentioned today, of the 70s and 80s, can often be defined as liberal in the present French political debate. Anyway, this new basically economical consensus, not a comprehensive liberal political views that embodied the Western opposition to communism from the 40s more or less to the late 70s, was the ideology upon which the globalized world was restructured after the fall of communism. It was a great success because of the enormous growth caused by the more open societies in general and by the opening of totally new markets, and most of all by the simultaneous huge technological revolution, and later due to the practice of easy indebtedness. The subsequent global economic crisis still ongoing, and the consequent discredit that the most radical interpretation of what is derogatively called Washington consensus are undergoing, should now not be allowed to drag liberalism into disrepute together with the economic crisis. A liberal society cannot survive without a free market economy. Not only because private enterprise is an inherent expression of individual freedom, and because the economic development that it alone can make possible, it is necessary in order to achieve a satisfactory degree of human development. But also because a liberal society, as I mentioned, must be polyarchic. Political power, economic power, and the power of the media should be as much separate as possible. Strong counterpowers to the political power are vital for a liberal and open society. And free trade is also the best guarantee for peace in a global world. Thanks to globalization, perhaps for the first time in history, the rise of a new global superpower like China is not leading to the threat of a war among the major powers, a war that today would be the global nuclear war that had been threatening all of us for 40 years. It is, however, not only a long overdue tribute to historical accuracy, but also a statement of fact that different views on the extent of legitimate and suitable state intervention and different ideas on the desirable level of equity of opportunities have always been present in the history of contemporary liberalism. We should remember this while trying to find out our way to the present global crisis. But both more Keynesians and more free trader liberals, or if you wish, more classical and more social liberals, should find a common ground on the overriding importance they both attach to the freedom and free development of the personality of each single individual. Personal freedom, freedom of speech, the right to a due process of law, protection from discrimination on the ground of ascribed identity, ethnicity, physical characters, age, disability, sex, gender, sexual orientation, or on the ground of political, cultural, and religious choices, and equal social dignity. The rule of law, human rights, liberal constitutional democracy are nowadays the joint heritage of all the democratic political families in Europe, but all these values and principles are the outcome of liberal initiative, liberal imprinting, liberal intellectual leadership in the past. We should be their most demanding interpreters today. The ever-impending risk of the tyranny of the majority is nowadays most notably visible in the debate concerning the rising and aggressive claims of religious fundamentalisms, both Christian and Islamic. The new bioethical issues, prohibitionist policies, and the controversies over multiculturalism are examples of these problems. On all these issues, we should stick to the rule that basic constitutional principles, individual liberties, equal rights and dignity, the rule of law, democracy, are the only acceptable binding civil bonds of an open society, despite the claims of populists and religious fundamentalists. That is what I propose to call the patriotism of the liberal Grundnorm, with an explicit reference to Jürgen Habermas's idea of constitutional patriotism and to Hans Kelsen's idea of Grundnorm. Probably you have heard of Habermas, but unless you studied law, Hans Kelsen was a legal philosopher, let's say, especially active in the 30s, an Austrian. This implies that the state or public powers can never be entitled to forcefully protect adult and sane individuals from themselves. Remember Locke, every man has a property in his own person. That individuals should always be treated as individuals, not as individual members of typified groups. That cultural diversity can never justify a compression of individuals' rights within minority communities or minority families, or those of minorities within minorities. That faith, ideas, and practice of the elders should never be forcefully imposed on those minors that are, I quote, capable of forming their own views, as stated by the New York 1989 Convention on the Rights of Children. No better institutional framework could be provided in order to protect these individual liberties and rights than that provided by our great and successful liberal tradition of religious neutrality and separation, as large as practically feasible, between religion and political power. This achievement was the converging result of the struggles both of deists, freethinkers, libertines, and immanentist or atheist philosophers, and that of religious minorities. In the new multi-religious situation, where many claim that interreligious dialogue is the key to any peaceful coexistence, we should never forget that the fight for religious freedom and freedom of conscience was from the start a fight against the religious supremacy of established churches, at the time in form of compulsory uniformity and intolerance, and only in the end the fight against the scourge of state atheism in communist countries or against Islamic fundamentalism. The role of separation between church and state, this is a quote from Thomas Jefferson, 1802, is even today the most secure and effective tool to protect the freedom of conscience of each single individual. On the contrary, today many religious leaders demand the public recognition on the part of our states and the European Union itself that is almost wherever in Europe the demand of Muslim leaders. And other established religions, first of all the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy, are thus trying to seize the opportunity to ask for a renewed public role of all religions that would inevitably confine non-believer and maverick believers, today's dissenters, as they were called in 17th century England, in the position of second-class citizens like the dhimmis in the Ottoman Empire. And they try to impose on all of us, by law, personal behaviors that are only consistent with the faith many of us do not share, and even many more do not share in its official interpretation, as it is the case of tens of millions of Catholics in Europe. An even more open threat to open societies come from those populist politicians who want no religious dialogue at all, but use the autochthonous religion or whatever other item they can find in their country's real or invented tradition, as tools to exclude people of no or other religion and the autochthonous individualists alike from their regressive dream of a society they would like to make more and more cohesive and intolerant through a renewed authoritarian imposition of some kind of anthropological uniformity. Christianity is for them nothing more than an ideological weapon to be brandished against minorities and or against immigrants. Claim for national identities or for a European identity based upon a single religion or indeed on one single culture are not candid, innocent claims. What is claimed is an exegetic principle, a criterion to be implemented in the interpretation of the entire system of law, creating first and second class citizens. The biggest challenge of the present time is the paradoxical erosion of the most precious historical values typical of our common civic identity, largely a part of a cultural acquis communautaire, as it is called in Brussels jargon, by populist politicians who pose as the keepers of our real identity and tradition and would like to cage all of us into closed, homogeneous and mutually hostile communitarian enclosures, the smaller and the most controlled, the better. Now, in our countries today and in the European Union, the liberals' task is not only to defend, but to enhance and to expand the achievements of our history that so largely coincides with the history of our institutions. And to defend, strengthen, and democratize and legitimize, democratically legitimize, I would stress, that the European Union that is for us in the global world the only possible tool allowing us to have a say in a world where all our old individual nation-states no longer have a voice strong enough to be remarked and taken into account, and strong enough to effectively stand for liberal principles together with the like-minded voices in today's international community. And remember, unlike what we are always led to think by an optimistic idea of the evolution of the humankind, like-minded voices in the world are today really not numberless. Sorry for being so long.